So let's just start with some of those facts about student loans. And one of the things that I really appreciated about your piece was it really captured how new a phenomena this is. And I think a lot of people don't really fully appreciate that. But just give us some facts. I mentioned $1.7 trillion. Give us some facts in terms of like the numbers of people holding this debt and how it's accrued relative to 30, 40 years ago.
Yeah, so the 1.7 trillion is obviously a standout number. That's about 45 million people. So, when you look at the population of the United States, that's actually a pretty significant portion that has outstanding student loan debt. And these days, graduates come out of college with something on the order of $30,000 on average in debt. And that, really, as an average, doesn't encompass the broad range and the different impacts that debt has on different demographics. So, in particular, African Americans are harmed, and women hold 2/3 of student loan debt. So it reflects the inequities in our society as well. And if you look at the history of the student loan program, it goes back to the late 50s under Eisenhower, when the United States kind of freaked out in response to the Russians launching Sputnik and felt like this represented a real competitive disadvantage for us in terms of science and engineering education. And a federal aid to education package was passed that had been a real sticking point for decades because of segregation and parochial school problems. So that's when you get a student loan program in the beginning. And at that point, it's very limited to certain fields of study. Johnson passes the Higher Education Act. You get more of a student loan program there. And these are all kind of compromises for scholarship programs that liberals wanted but couldn't get. So you get a student loan program because it's cheaper. And it kind of just grows and grows. Under Reagan, we get a lot of disinvestment on the federal and state level. Tuitions just keep going up and up and up and up. And at the same time, loans start becoming more possible to get, even for people who aren't of, lower means. The limitations are reduced. And eventually you get to a point where it just like balloons out of control. So in 2012, that's when we hit $1 trillion. And that was right after Occupy Wall Street. And so there's kind of this conjunction with the occupiers who had been already kind of harping on this. And now you've got kind of a media point. People are starting to realize, oh, wait, this is really, really getting to be a huge problem.
You pegged the cost of college back in 40 years ago, and you pegged it to state universities. And of course, what happened? State universities started raising their money, and that created upward pressure on the tuitions, private and state colleges. And like you say, because of Reagan cutbacks, we saw states having to react to that. And I was like, 40 years ago, well, that's ancient history. And I realized, wait a second, no, I attended college about as a freshman about 35 years ago. And so I would have been applying for college, somewhere around the time that you cited. And I'm like, no, that's why I think there's so much difficulty in our society for people to appreciate the how dramatic this is, and how much of a weight it is on a generation like millennials, for instance. So, I mean, give us those numbers and how it is that loans became a little bit easier.
Yeah. So one of the things you have actually in the Carter era is something called the Middle Income Student Assistance Act, MISA, and that opens up subsidized loans to middle income people. So there you get a kind of expansion. Previously, that was only, you had to meet certain low income qualifications. Prior to the 80s, when the Pell Grant was introduced in 72, named after Senator Claiborne Pell, it covered a large portion of a state school's tuition, and even cut into some fees and housing expenses. So the Pell Grant was really something that you could rely on, and student loans were kind of, if you can't quite make it all the way, you can take out some extra. Um, and then yeah, you start seeing just this ballooning happen in the 80s. People are able to get more debt. And as, subsidies, the Pell Grant, for instance, didn't keep up with inflation. It's not a mandatory appropriation, so it has to be reauthorized. And that means that the limit just doesn't always increase as much as it should. It can be a very big sticking point. So that starts covering less and less of the cost. And, it's interesting. My mom actually went to college in the 80s. And she came out with some student loan debt, but eventually was able to pay it off. And so I think for my generation, I am a millennial. We were encouraged by our parents to take on debt because it was seen as something good debt. An education is going to help you make more money over the course of your career and your lifetime. But I think that generation didn't appreciate what had changed in the 20 years or however long since they had gone to college. And so there has been this real generational pushback. I wrote a piece a while back about student loans, and I heard back from my editor that the younger editorial staff were all gung-ho, but they had to kind of convince the older editors that this was really a problem. And so there has been that kind of difficulty in really advertising the change, and it's not the way it used to be. It's not just pay your debts. I did too. It's a different monster.
It's a different monster because of the cost. I mean, you did a comparison of what 40 years ago, a year of tuition and fees at a public 4-year university was around $2,400. Not in $1980, but in 2019 dollars.
Right.
So that's stunning.
Yeah.
That's stunning. I have no idea where you could go for that. Anything even remotely close to that in a 4-year university now. And you said now the cost is 4 times as much. And I would imagine all of the sort of other incidentals are higher. Mm-hmm. Plus, on top of that, any job that you work has also not kept up in terms of wages. So right. the delta between what you got to pay for college and the idea I can work 5 or 10 hours a week and subsidize that gulf has gotten bigger. And for private colleges, you say that number has tripled from almost 11,000 in 1980. That would have been in 2019 dollars to $32,000 in 2019. And again, those are averages. And the other point that you were making in terms of the Pell Grants shrinking and that creating a market for loans, I think that also provides at least a significant amount of evidence that the increase in these tuitions was not driven, at the very least, exclusively, and probably not predominantly, by the availability of these loans. That the loans were simply making up for support that was coming in other places. And so, one of the right-wing stories about this is that, the reason why prices went up was because loans were available, and that we just don't see that correlate in the same way. So we have this situation. When did it really start to balloon? It starts to take off in the 1980s, but where does it become really sort of get real? I don't know. Where does it go into the stratosphere as opposed to just sort of lift off?
Well, I think in 2010, it surpassed credit card debt to become the second biggest source of household debt under mortgages. And that was a point where people, I think, were kind of what? And then shortly thereafter, 2012, it hits $1 trillion. And that's obviously kind of a good headline number. So that's, I think, people were really not paying attention until those 2 points were hit.
And you're right. The Fed wasn't even tracking it until 1999. So 20 years were it was just not significant in terms of an economic factor in the context of our society.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. And on the point of colleges raising costs because of loans, I think you're right. And it is very hard to tease out why has tuition grown so much. And there are all these different factors. Many people dispute that argument that loan availability has raised costs. There's also the question of privatization generally, relying on corporate buy-ins to do research and other kinds of things. And I recently read a book called The Great Mistake by Christopher Newfield. Amazing analysis of the sort of reasons that tuition has gone up and how it really does link back to privatization, both in terms of the university's funding streams and kind of pushing the cost onto individual students to debt finance.
I'm speaking with Ryan Liebenthal. Hi, I'm Sam Seder. You can watch the rest of this interview and more on our Peacock show, which streams at 5 p.m. weekdays on The Choice from Peacock TV.